As a 16-year-old, I lived on the West Side. And the West Side was a community. It was mostly composed of, majority were Jewish workers, Jewish people, but the workers in the main. My parents were workers, and they worked in restaurants in the corner of St. Louis and Roosevelt Road, which was kind of our corner. My father was a cook. I gather you were interested in why, as a young person, 16 years old, I found myself coming out to the Memorial Day Massacre. I came to this country in 1929 from Poland. I was 12 years old. And my father had been here for 9 years. It was very difficult. Families were divided, and they finally were able to come. My brother, my mother, and I came at that time. And we lived in the West Side because it was a Jewish community, and that's where immigrants generally settled, in the communities where they felt at home. And they felt at home in communities that reflected their nationality. And because we didn't know the language, there were stores there where they spoke Yiddish, and there were schools where you could make certain reference to the language that you knew. I knew 2 languages at that time. I knew Polish and I knew Jewish. I very quickly forgot the Polish because I had nobody to talk to in that language. But Yiddish I retain to this day. And read, write, and speak, because that's what we used at home. So the West Side was a very friendly place. But I came at a time when the Depression had begun. Very quickly, my father had lost his job, and we were really struggling. And what I observed was turbulence, even though I started school and I had to start in the 1st grade because I had to learn the language. But I went through the grammar school very quickly in 1 year to just learn the language and then move on. The West Side was really a truly friendly community, and it welcomed people like me, and we weren't ridiculed if we didn't know the language or we mispronounced something. The turbulence took the form of what I noticed. There were certain rallies in the West Side and certain street corners. I didn't understand what they were about, but people would get up on the soapboxes and talk about their problems, either unemployment or bad schools or bad housing or the inability, mainly the inability to get work. It was a depression, and that's what affected the lives of everybody. So that there was a fantastic feeling of community. The other thing, at that time, people didn't just live in their houses and lock their doors. People lived in the streets. It was an entirely different atmosphere where people didn't have guns, and they didn't have, just the police had guns. But people didn't have guns, and if you wanted to hit somebody, you did it with your fists. So that when people walked out on the street, they weren't afraid. And in the evenings particularly, it was lovely. People kind of, there's a Jewish word that's called spazier. You just kind of walk the streets, and you meet people, and you say hi, and you stop, and then you stop in the ice cream stores, or you stop in a restaurant to get a bite of one type or another. Well, what happened is that I wasn't aware of it in as deep a sense as I was just living in the West Side and learning about it, except that we knew through mainly some of the gatherings that we had. And there was a wonderful institution called the Jewish People's Institute. And we used to gather there, and we'd have a current events club. And we used to discuss some of the issues. And we were aware of the fact that the beginning of the organization of unions was kind of telegraphed to us. And there were a number of very important industries in the West Side. One of the biggest was the farm equipment industry, the Harvester, the McCormick, and the other plants. And we were aware that they were organizing there. And so that occasionally we would meet people who would tell us, well, they're having difficulty, problems, and we got the inkling that there too, there was not only the opposition of the bosses, which we knew, but that somehow the bosses were always able to get the police. My mother was not a citizen. In fact, my mother didn't become a citizen. I don't believe she ever was a citizen. But my father was a citizen, and I don't know if he voted, but I'm sure he probably did, and if he did, he voted for Roosevelt. Well, we became aware of it through what was reflected in newspapers and through people who talked about it. Some of my friends whose parents were involved in one form or another in this industry and that industry, and they would talk about, well, they're trying to organize this industry and they're trying to organize that industry. And so we became aware. And then later on, we formed this current events club at the Jewish People's Institute. They weren't too excited about it. We kind of had to do it a little bit with subterfuge. And then we talked about current events. And it was my introduction, actually, to some of the social issues that were developing. Because when I came to this country, as I said, I had to concentrate on learning the language and going to school. And it was not easy. If people who have not been immigrants cannot possibly appreciate the difficulty it was for an immigrant to adjust in this country. Even though everybody says we're a country of immigrants. Yes, we are a country of immigrants, but the immigrants who came earlier and were able to get a foothold and get established a little bit began to look down on the immigrants that were coming in later. Nothing has changed on that. We still do that. Before, the immigrants were Irish and English and German and white, more acceptable. Today, the immigrants are a little different. They're of color. They may be from Haiti, or they may be from Guatemala, or they may be from another Latin American country, from Mexico, and Puerto Ricans. And so there's a different type of prejudice. The blacks at that time, and of course they weren't referred to as blacks at that time, were not a factor in my early days in this country. And actually, I didn't become aware of blacks until I became involved in some of the activities around the plants and the unions, because the black workers were beginning to enter the industries. They were brought up from the South first, historically, as strikebreakers. And then later on, they became established. They became workers, and in the factories at that time, there was very hard work, very difficult work, and the black workers, or the Negroes, were brought in to the most difficult aspects of the work. And the more rarefied areas, the skilled workers, the machinist departments and so on, were still populated by the white skilled workers. And the black workers at that time were not given the opportunity to learn these skills. But I wasn't that smart at that time to know all this. It was in later years that I could understand what was happening there. One of the interesting things about the West Side is that it was not only an activist community, all kinds of trends and all kinds of groupings, and there were certain institutions that existed at that time. And one of them was the Jewish People's Institute on St. Louis and Douglas Boulevard. And they had all kinds of wonderful activities for young people. They had a swimming pool and a gymnasium, and they had certain concerts, and they had a roof garden where they organized dances and so on. So some of us used to go to the Jewish People's Institute, and we weren't interested in the things that they were doing because they weren't really reflecting the things that we became aware of, the turmoil in among the people, the restlessness, the unemployment. And so we organized the Current Events Club. And that Current Events Club was the group that was very, very helpful to me to begin to understand what was happening in the community, as well as in kind of in the city as a whole, and was my introduction to an understanding of some of these issues. And it was through this Current Events Club that we began to participate in various labor activities. For example, the International Harvester Mills. Because they were all organizing at that time, and it was around the time of the founding of the CIO, which was a very great advance, because they were organizing workers on an industrial basis, so that people who were always left out of unions had the first opportunity to get into them. And that was a very revolutionary development as far as the labor movement was concerned. So we became interested. We discussed that in the Current Events Club. And then we were asked to go out to the picket line of the harvester plant, and we did. And we worked in the kitchens and helped set up the soup kitchens for the workers. And then somebody suggested that there was some development in the steel mills, that they were negotiating this contract, that United Steel had signed their contract, and the workers were very happy, but that small steel, the little steel plants, made a decision to buck the union. They weren't going to sign. And the worst of them was Tom Girdler of Inland Steel. The worst of them was Tom Girdler of Republic Steel. And we became aware of it. We had never seen the man and so on, but we knew that he was one of these vicious employers who just was not going to give in to anything. And the workers, we knew, were on strike then in all the small steel plants, Youngstown, Inland, and Republic. And the union had suggested that a series of rallies take place, and they had a number of rallies on, I believe, Friday before Memorial Day and various other days. And then the decision was made to call a citywide rally to try to get the support of as many community people as possible. And that's where we came into the picture, and it was suggested to us in the club that we go out there on Memorial Day. And we did that. We went in a couple of cars, and we came out there, and it was gorgeous day, absolutely a beautiful day. One of these magnificent, sunshiny days. And we were very happy to be out there because it was a prairie. There was hardly anything there. Except the big mills. And there was the saloon, Sam's Place, which was the watering hole for the workers when they got through with a big, heavy day. And this sort of became the headquarters of the strikers. We went there, and we went to Sam's Place. And there were thousands of people there. By the time we got there, the place was a sea of people. And the most interesting and wonderful thing was that it was a family day. People came out there like a picnic. We're going to support the steel workers, and we're going to enjoy a picnic day with our families. And it looked like God shone on that idea. So when we came there, we joined right in, and we went over there at Sam's Place, and they set up a small platform. And some of us had already learned a lot of the labor songs, and I had a fairly good voice. They said, "Come on, Mollie, lead some of the singing." And we had some songs. There was a song about CIO, and of course Solidarity Forever, which already had become the theme, the anthem of the labor movement. And so I got up there and was leading the singing like I knew what I was doing. And the workers were just loved it. I mean, everybody was singing and joyful and marvelous, very optimistic, and a feeling that we're going to win this. We're really going to win it. And we showed that we weren't alone, that the people of the city were with us, And this was a very inspirational moment. So there were a number of speakers, and they tried to keep it short, which was nice. And then they suggested that we all walk towards the gate, just to see what the gate looks like and to show that since they refused to allow picketing right in front of the gate, they feeling was that this would be a nice way of just walking closer to the gate. So nobody lined up, and there wasn't anything like a march. We just walked, and people were talking and holding hands, and the children were being carried by their fathers on their shoulders, and everybody was laughing, and it was a joyous thing. And none of the workers, and this later on became an important point, nobody carried a stick or a stone or anything. They carried their children, they carried their lunch baskets, and maybe some of them that time didn't have canned beer, so maybe they had a drink of some kind. And we walked, and we were walking towards the gate. And as we came closer to the mill, the walking slowed a bit. Now, I wasn't way up in the front line, but I wasn't very far back either. And as it slowed a bit, we tried to find out what was happening, and obviously the people in the front of the line had already seen what was happening. And what was happening there is that the mill was completely surrounded by cordons of police. It seemed like the entire police force of the city of Chicago was out there. And they had their guns drawn, and there were machine guns up on the roofs. And the people were, at that point, beginning to get sort of concerned, and the mood began to change a bit, particularly the people in the front. But it didn't deter. We were still going to go over to the mill and just conduct a peaceful mass picket line without signs, and just walking in front with this tremendous outpouring of support from the city as a whole. And then, all of a sudden, we heard shots, and the people, there was a bewilderment. They didn't realize what was actually happening. And then pretty soon, we felt that the line, instead of going forward, was walking back, because people began to realize that they were being shot at. And they were trying to move out of the line of fire. I, being not too far, but yet not in the front, as the line was pushing back, I was knocked down. And I wore glasses then. I lost my glasses. And then a whole number of people were piled up on top of me, and I could barely breathe. And I don't know how long the shooting took place, but also there was tear gas. And the tear gas blinded some of us. And also it was very difficult because we began to inhale it, and it began to choke some of us. And what happened is that when the shooting finally stopped and the silence prevailed, people finally began to get on their feet. And when I finally stood up, and total bewilderment, I looked around and I saw a battlefield. Yes, it was a battlefield. There's no question. And in my entire life, that was the first time and only time that I saw a battlefield in action, actually. I've seen a lot of battlefields in movies, but I was there. The carnage was unbelievable. There were bodies strewn all over. There were people trying to carry others off the field. There was crying and moaning. I wouldn't say there was hysteria. There was fear, terrible fear, and, of course, a terrible anger. And as I was finally getting up, and I stood up, I felt something in the back, my back, and there was a policeman with a gun pointed on my back and said, "Get off the field before I put a bullet through your back." And at that point, some of my friends came running back and just kind of scooped me up and took me back to Sam's place. And of course, Sam's place was, as I mentioned, it was a hospital. At that point, it was a first aid station. Because a number of doctors had come out, partly because they were socially conscious and they wanted to participate, and some because they figured, well, maybe in a big demonstration like that, there's always a need for first aid. And so they kind of set up a first aid operation at Sam's place. But the demands on that was entirely different. It wasn't just bandaging a child's foot or something, but it was a major, major disaster. And when you see in the movies or you read about the current wars, you see what a first aid station is and what it means to take bodies off a battlefield. And it was an absolute, incredible, devastating moment for me. And it was at that time, as a result of that I began to understand what I had been talking about without fully comprehending the difference between bosses and workers, who has the power, and where the state is, which side the state is. And by the state, we mean the police and the army and so on. That's a state. That's what the state is. And they weren't with the workers. And I say this now, but it didn't really begin to be articulated in my own understanding until much later, when I, of course, began to be more involved. But it did establish one thing. I knew which side I was on, and I was on the side of the workers. As I mentioned, when I was taken off the field by my friends, they put me in a car, and we went back to the Jewish People's Institute. And we certainly were not going to be going to a dance. There were just a handful of us. And the roof garden was filled. It was a gorgeous, as I mentioned, a gorgeous night, gorgeous day, and it was a gorgeous night. And it was filled with young people. Well, instead of having a dance, those of us who came back transformed that dance into what I believe was the first protest meeting of the Memorial Day Massacre. And my friends tell me that when I was asked to speak, and I did speak, that they had probably never heard me before or since, because I made a lot of speeches since then, that reflected the feeling and the emotion and the facts about the terrible tragedy that had taken place in South Chicago, to which we were going as observers and participants and bystanders, but not as part of the workers at that time. I think I couldn't remember. This is a time when you wish you had a tape recorder and you could have taken something down, because it's such a historic moment. But basically what I said is what I've just told you. I just came back from a battlefield, and I described what had happened. And I told them in just very simple language what actually took place. And it began, and the importance of it was such that the newspapers, of course, gave a totally different story. They were saying the workers, had clubs and they had stones, and that they actually put the blame of the events on the workers, as though the workers provoked it. instead of telling the truth, that it was the police who were there, and the totally marvelous, friendly, warm solidarity atmosphere that existed, and that it wasn't a march. It was, as I said before, it was like a spazier, the Jewish word of a friendly walk in a gorgeous day. And that's what I expressed to the people. And I must tell you that it must have had a tremendous impact on the people who were listening, because to this day, when I meet some of the people who heard me speak that night, said that they were never so moved and were never so influenced in terms of their attitude towards labor as they were on that night and at that particular moment. I was aware of, after a while, what happened is that for months we were consumed by these events. And even as a young person, and having been there, I followed it. I can't remember exactly what was said and how it was said. There were some distortions, but they couldn't deny. Of course, the mayor then, I believe, was Kelly, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, they try to put on an entirely different story. But we were there. We knew. So whatever distortions took place in the press, it was countered by a number of other reporters and other people who were witnesses, who had influences, and doctors like Dr. Quentin Young and others were able to tell the true story. And later on, during the congressional hearings, of course, they couldn't hide the full truth of that. And it made a change in the attitude of the police department. And while it didn't completely cure them of the great temptation to be violent towards strikers, which continued for quite a while, it was muted to a large extent. It wasn't the same kind of use of these kinds of weapons and the killing and murder. Of course, it took place in other cases too. Well, from a political point of view, from what I remember, is that what happened is that the Roosevelt administration was in power, and the workers were very much in support of the Roosevelt administration because you had the enactment of the Wagner Act, which legalized the right to organize. And that was an enormous event, so that I don't remember exactly the statements and the basic position of the entire political movement, but there's no question that many of the congressmen and senators who were elected at that time had to confront this issue and had to take sides and had to take positions. Now, some of them, of course, defended the employers, and many defended, of course, the workers, and the whole movement for the right to organize took on an enormous momentum from that point on. What comes to mind to me that he was one of those killer employers, that what his main objective was to keep the workers exactly the way he kept them, prior to the attempt of the workers to organize. The lowest possible wages, the lousiest possible conditions, the lack of any kind of a human consideration towards the workers. His main motivation was how to make the most money out of giving the least back to the workers. That was his philosophy, and that over his dead body was he going to allow a union to come in there. And that was the position of a lot of the employers. That's why in many instances there were violent episodes later on with the auto workers around Henry Ford and so on, which we later became aware of. But what happened to me individually is that I began to follow events in the labor movement, even though I was still a student. Later on, after graduation, I became an office worker, and I helped actually organize one of the first unions, the Office Workers Union.